So I think I'll go ahead and I'll just read the first question.
Okay.
The first question comes, there's a quote. The quote reads, "To view the world today through a feminist of color lens shatters all barriers of state-imposed nationality." So the question is, this is an invitation in the form of a declaration. When you think of it, does it land as true? What is your relationship to feminists of color outside of your own experience? And do these stories and experiences make your relationship to feminism and activism expansive, or is it contracting? In other words, are you strengthened by those connections to the experiences of women of color? Did you want to share anything about any of the questions that are there, Michelle?
Well, let me look at question one.
Mm-hmm.
My relationship to feminists of color outside of my own experience. I don't know that I have a lot of those in my later life.
Mm-hmm.
I used to have quite a few connections to other women other than Black women in my younger days. And I did always find it, I guess I would choose expansive as the word there, or just fascinating to learn about their experiences, the similarities and the differences. And it's those kinds of experiences that help to teach me. You know, we really can't make assumptions about people just based on one aspect of their identity, like gender. So, you know, just because you're a woman, it doesn't mean we're all having the same experiences or drawing the same conclusions or necessarily on the same page. So, I'd say I found it expansive.
Yeah, thank you. I would say that matches my experience as well. I think largely because most of my involvement in feminist spaces has come from the fact that I've worked in like helping nonprofits that have been focused on supporting women. And because I live in Vancouver now, but I'm from Toronto, which is a very like cosmopolitan international city, I had a lot of exposure from childhood through to the stories of women from around the world. And so, while it has been expansive, it's helped me. I've had a very clear understanding from a young age of there being definitely a unifying experience that comes from being a person of color and being a woman of color. I mean, I think in the book here, they talk about how even if you're like born and raised, say like in the Western world or North America, or because the book is American, it's talking about in the United States that like women of color have like this experience of like understanding innately the struggles of what I think I think there's some kind of term like third world understanding of the world. So, and I think now if we were using more kind of common or modern language, it's like there's a sense of being part of the global majority, even though we're North American based. So that's been really helpful. Good to see you, Nicole. That's been really fruitful in terms of my understanding of feminism and the impacting role of women has almost always come from an international lens because of my exposure since childhood.
Yeah, and I think exposure there is really a key word. Like I'm thinking about Cherríe in the book. There's a, I think it may be when she first met Barbara Smith or some Black woman, and they said to her, you know, something like, "I used to think you were so white," and Cherríe said, "Yeah, I used to think I was so white also."
Yeah.
And you know, and so her interactions with other women of color is, you know, what helped to put her in touch with her own Latina heritage. Yeah.
That would be my guess.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but you know, it's also interesting, Leonie, in the way that that integration has functioned and immigration has functioned in the United States, that you know, often leaves us feeling more aware of our differences um, from our ethnic backgrounds than feeling the kind of um, solidarity that I think, particularly in this late 70s, early 80s period, um, progressive people were trying to forge. You know, but that strategy of divide and conquer, I mean, you know, they're never going to stop using it because it's good shit. It works.
Yeah, one of the things that I really appreciated in the reading of the pages that were for tonight was how the thread of kind of like Black Asian tensions, kind of one of the sources that it comes from was that in the United States, that there were funds that were available. I think they made reference to like the Martin Luther King Fund and stuff that were about trying to establish Black businesses within Black neighborhoods that came specifically out of the struggle, the civil rights struggle, and that those funds were withdrawn from the Black community and given directly to Asian communities.
Right.
Which is where the phenomenon of Asian businesses being in Black neighborhoods has come from, and then has led to some of the tensions, including, like, I remember reading about stuff happening between Koreans and Black people, like in Bedford-Stuy, other parts of Brooklyn and other parts of New York. And of course, it was a central piece of what was happening in 1992 around the riots around Rodney King. Was this the fact that you had Asian business owners within Black communities, and here it is. It comes from that whole idea of model minority and divestment from Black communities, and between Asians and Blacks.
Even now, we're seeing, you know, through this current global pandemic, that so many of the healthcare workers, you know, come from India, you know, and you know, in other places, but that's a large segment, and you know, there's a lot of intentionality to that, and so if you give all kinds of incentives for certain people to come into the country, you know, and treat them well, then they don't have an automatic reason to identify with the downtrodden, you know, of the indigenous communities there.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've seen a lot of that. And you know, it was kind of interesting to me in the early days of the pandemic in New York, people's racism toward Asians was like off the charts,
Mm-hmm.
you know, off the charts. And, you know, I just was trying to look at it from like a Chinese person's perspective. To a large degree, they've been coddled and loved and, you know, held up.
Yeah, as the model, kind of model minority.
Right. And, you know, all of a sudden people are, not that they don't have an experience of racism in the United States from back in the day, but, you know, in the most recent decades, it seems like they've been doing okay. And then it seems like all of a sudden, you know, people just turned on them, and it was ugly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how Cherríe Moraga explains, like, you know, we look in the at the very beginning, kind of, yes, she offers us, I want to say it's poetry. It's really beautiful.
Yeah.
In the preface, and she says, you know, we look across oceans for hope. And so, and I'm sorry, you all, I need to look at the question. I'm just speaking out.
Okay.
I'm probably not even at line with the question. But what Michelle said, it makes me think about that, because I believe that this is just straight up, like, her preface is a refusal. She's saying, like, there is no way for us to speak of feminism. It's just, you can't do it anymore if we're talking about these kinds of single kind of group issues, and that there has to be solidarity across and among these groups. And, you know, and of course we understand that, and you know, here, this is a clear, like, call to action, that this is how we're going to move forward. And she uses all the language of what we understand as intersectionality, whether we're going to call it, you know, the Combahee River Collective, if we're going to talk about interlocking oppressions, or we're gonna name it intersectionality, or as she talks about, the simultaneity of oppression. But there is no way that we are going to do this thing if we don't develop this kind of third world consciousness. I think, and I love how she's talking among and into all, among groups, you know, into all groups, like you're saying, Michelle, in particular, the Black American community, when we talk about our Asian and Asian American counterparts, you know, a lot of times there have been, you know, grievances. You know, unfortunately, what's her name, in LA? Gosh, what's her name? Oh God, it's right on the tip of my tongue. But remember, she was shot and killed. She's trying to get, what was it, milk or something for her?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Yeah, the baby. I can't remember. Oh God, it's right here, and I should never forget that name. I'm always saying her name, but.
And it needs now attention. So we're looking at the first question, Kim. So you know that's what Nicole is responding to now, and Michelle and I have already responded. So we'd love to hear from you, Nicole.
I'm just happy with this book, so I'm trying to contain my passion. But I just want to close it by saying, yes, I do agree. This does land with me. It strikes me as very reasonable and yet rigorous and transformational. And so, yeah, to the question you asked, and you said, are you strengthened by those connections to the experiences of women of color? And I must be honest, kind of the majority of my experiences with women of color, they have overwhelmingly been with, Black women. And to be specific, Black working class women who are, kind of caught between, well, we have these working class sensibilities. I don't necessarily know if we would be considered still working class, but our sensibilities are very much the working class. But but I'm growing and expanding. And so, yes, I am, I'm more women of color. It's broadening kind of my bandwidth, if you will. More additional women of color groups. I have some comrades that I'm working with, and we do theoretical, we study theory together, and it's been wonderful working with them, and they're wonderful Asian women, Asian American. And so, I do think her call to kind of this third world consciousness is a path forward. Okay, I'm going to pass the baton.
Thanks for your contributions, Nicole. Do you have anything that you'd like to share? I'd love to hear your perspective, Kim. Oh, is it frozen? Are you frozen? I think Kim's frozen.
She's frozen. Yeah.
Yep, now she's dropped off. Okay, well, hopefully she'll return.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's so interesting because like what I was sharing with Michelle is that from the time I was young, because I grew up in a city that's like one of the most diverse, if not the most diverse city in the world, then my introduction to like this idea of this understanding of feminism has been present with me since childhood. Like I've always been around a group of people, and segregation is not so entrenched where in the place that I grew up in. And so that's one of the things I think that is lost by the system, particularly, if we're looking at like in the United States, is that part of why it makes sense for me that it would be Black women or African Americans is because there is such structural divisions between races, and that actually people have been confused. I was actually in a conversation with two women, one of East Asian descent and one who is is Arab, born in Egypt. So, and how both there's a sense of like, not for both, but in the conversation, confusion and pain around how, for the East Asian woman, she was speaking about like how she didn't grow up with the sense of like being a person of color. And even though she experienced tremendous amounts of racism, but the conversation in the United States, in her experience, is person of color meant Black person. And that even people would tell her, well, you're not a person of color, or I wouldn't say or do this thing if you were a person of color. So not even being seen as that, and the other piece of kind of like pain that the person, that another person, the one who is from Egypt shared, was that like how much pain she has in seeing that Arabs are like fighting to be white on the census or something like that. Like it was just, all the stuff that's coming up, and it's like these are just examples of structural oppression, and they take us away from the gifts that we have to give to each other. Because definitely, I don't know what your experience is now, but when I'm with people of color, I know that I'm with people of color, and I don't, there's all kinds of shortcuts you can take. There's just like a sense of understanding that's there. Yeah.